All of us know how it feels to be told you can't do something. There's just something hardwired into our minds to resist that by default, especially if you're me and you've been told that you're stubborn since you were about 3 years old. If there's like a wet paint sign, you want to touch it just to check. A waiter hands you a plate and says it's hot, almost everyone will reach out and decide to give themselves third-degree burns. The biggest lure of all is a big red button saying do not press. No matter how sensible and allegedly smart we are or become, there are always going to be instances that seem to just pull in our subconscious. That might explain why a young Brazil boy found himself drawn to a local reservoir in 1988. Having been told explicitly not to go there, it was a place fraught with danger, not only from the water itself and its remote location, but because gangs sometimes dump bodies in the area. And it was not worth your life to interrupt a ruthless individual disposing of evidence. But it might have been the ultimate "I told you so" when he made a gruesome discovery, one that is far beyond what anyone could have expected. So much so that it invokes suspicions that were completely out of this world, or potentially at least out of this galaxy. The young man lived in south of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and on the afternoon of the 29th of September, he had set off to collect some insects or bugs to add to his collection. The reservoir where he decided to find them is known as the Reservoir of Guarapiranga, or Represa de Guarapiranga in local language. And I'm like 2% sure that's the correct saying, or at least pronunciation of that. So
Represa de Guarapiranga.
Guarapiranga Dam.
don't worry, I'm sure somebody will tell me in the comments. A sprawling, windy expanse of water, far different from the placid, regular-shaped pools that we would imagine. It is nearly 12 miles, more than 19 kilometers long, while being less than 2 miles or 3 kilometers wide at its most broad. The main section may look like how we'd picture a reservoir, but the rest would look like a lake with rivers and streams flowing in. With more than 170 million cubic meters of water, it serves the needs of the people in the surrounding area. When it was initially constructed, the main function was intended to be a generation of hydroelectric power. The main river that feeds it, the Guarapiranga, flowed in, and the water exiting provided electrical power. But it soon became adapted to be used as a holding tank and supply for locals to use as like drinking water and bathing water. Unfortunately, since there was a distinct lack of overall government regulation and control at the time, many communities who built around it dumped their waste and cleaned themselves in what was supposed to be drinking water. Due to this, the cleanliness and suitability of the water within the reservoir has varied over time, to the extent that it was declared unfit for human use on a number of occasions. Not that this small fact has ever stopped the people who actually relied on it, because where are they going to get their water? By the time this young man was on a search for bugs around the edges of the reservoir, there had been a concentrated effort to clean up the main river that fed it, as well as the smaller tributaries, in an effort to maintain a safe and clean supply of water for all who needed it. And it wasn't just a safety concern over like falling in and drowning that had discouraged the local youth from exploring the meandering banks of the reservoir alone. There were frequent instances of criminal activity around the more secluded areas, as well as the smaller rivers that fed it, serving as handy dumping grounds to dispose of murder victims. These bodies would be dropped by the banks and occasionally make their way through the natural flows into the reservoir itself, where they would absolutely contaminate the drinking water. However, what he would find on this day while he was looking for these bugs would do very little to encourage anyone that had relied on the Guarapiranga Reservoir for their water in recent memory. As the boy approached the waters, high above him, he noticed birds circling ominously in the warm sky the closer he got. And with him getting closer, the more certain he became that there was someone who was actually like just lying there just a little ways away from him. But at a quick glance, it was enough to let him know that this man was not in fact sleeping. Instead of the insects he was looking to collect, the young man stumbled across a body, and he ran to tell the people what he had found, with a haunting image to stick in his memory for the rest of time, and the most undeniable "I told you so" from his mom, probably. Sadly, as with many areas, both at the time and now, there was nothing particularly surprising about finding someone dead in a remote location here. One of the main reasons that locals avoided traveling the reservoir banks alone was that the known frequent dumping of bodies or stashing of evidence by all the gang activity located nearby. However, there are some elements to this discovery that led to it still being discussed now, more than 3 decades later. The police arrived and made their initial assessment, confirming that the man was in fact dead, but it was the condition of his body that caused the story to spread around the local area. While the results of the official autopsy wouldn't be known for at least until about 6 years later, the state of the body was talked about in hushed tones by those around the area. Apparently, there was almost no smell to the body itself, as would be expected from a corpse that sat in the blazing sun for an extended period of time. And one of the reasons for the lack of decomposition was that most of the internal organs had been removed. The intestines had been taken out entirely, and there was no blood visible anywhere around the location to find. The man's head had suffered the most extreme mutilation, with one ear missing, eyes removed, and the tongue entirely gone. And while there may have been some cooler heads talking about gangland slayings and maybe local scavenging wildlife, the reason that minds of many in the area were directed skyward rather than towards Earth are because of just how surgical it appeared. It was only 2 years earlier when the skies above 4 separate Brazilian states, including the one where the body was found, were filled with unidentified flying objects. People spotting unknown things in the sky is a fairly regular occurrence, actually. Even something appearing on radar or military monitoring equipment actually really isn't hugely rare. But the scale and scope of May 19th, 1986 was truly incredible. The event kicked off not with like mad ramblings of an alien theorist or a UFO believer, but an air traffic controller at the São José dos Campos airport. While working on the night shift, they spotted a set of lights seeming to hover over the airfield, which they tried to identify using binoculars. When he turned down the lights of the runway, the lights approached him but backed off when he upped the intensity back to normal. It's important to note that this initial observation is interesting for 2 separate reasons. The first is that it was made by a man who spends his days working all forms of aircraft approaching and leaving for a living. He's not some half-crazed local yokel who wouldn't know a Boeing 747 from a hang glider or misidentifying standing airport lights as something floating in the air. The second and maybe even more important point is that another nearby airport picked up some hits on a monitoring equipment in the same area. So immediately we have eyewitness accounts by someone who should know what they are looking for and looking at, and confirmation from a second unbiased technological source. The controller at São José de Campos described the moving lights as mainly red but often changing color. 45 minutes later, a pilot who was making their approach into the same airport reported seeing red lights in the sky, which seemed to be in motion. The description he offered was that they were like big red stars. When he moved towards them, they moved further away and out of his range. About half an hour after this, the closest Air Force base was put on standby. There were now multiple unknown pings on the radar of São José dos Campos Airport, and no one seemed to be able to adequately explain or identify them. Within the hour, another unidentified radar contact caused the second airbase to be put on standby. By about 10:30 p.m., there was sufficient uncertainty around what was in the sky above and around the airports that a fighter jet was scrambled and sent into the dark Brazilian sky to make sense of the radar pings. It managed to get eyes on the unidentified object, describing these same changing lights that rotated between red, white, and green. Once again, when he tried to get close, or at least close the distance, the object moved further away. A second jet was sent into the air at 10:48 p.m., which didn't manage to physically see anything but had 5 separate contacts on his radar system. Never able to get close enough than more than 2 miles, he reported that they appeared to move in some sort of formation. They were traveling at immense speed and moving in a manner that was both erratic and beyond what most military aircraft could manage. By the time a third pilot had taken off 2 minutes later, it appeared to have more luck, or at least they appeared to have more luck. He managed to spot the telltale lights, but when he got close, rather than moving away, the lights went out. Despite multiple indications from the monitoring crews on the ground of more than 10 unknown flying objects tailing this third jet, when he made a turn and faced behind, there was nothing that could be seen. It would be 2009 before the report from the Night of UFOs was released, and it wouldn't detail much more than what had already been heard. Only that there were a total of more than 20 unknown radar plots picked up in the night that could continue to defy explanation, and probably that also there was an unknown aircraft that moved with incredible speed and maneuverability. There were no incidents that were reported, no damage done or people injured, just a very confused local population and a cause for debate and discussion amongst the Brazilian military and aviation community. To this day, no reasonable explanation seems to have ever been offered. Given this very recent and raw memory in the minds of the Brazilian public, with their eyes and thoughts clearly fixated on something unknown stalking their skies, it might not be as strange as it first appears that their mind went to alien intervention rather than anything more mundane. It would be far from the first time that aliens were implicated in acts of random abduction. Across the decades, they seem to have some strange or otherwise unexplained bodies landing squarely at their door. Blame for the killing and mutilations of cattle up in front of the court of public opinion anytime that a body, human or otherwise, turns up having been killed in a manner that defies explanations. The first thing we say, probably aliens. With that said, the whole concept of a person being taken by some alien being for supernatural investigation was arguably started near the 1960s. A couple with the names Barney and Betty Hill were traveling through New Hampshire in September of 1961 when they claimed to have encountered a flying craft that described as being odd-shaped and covered in lights of every color. And if you would like to see a video on that, I actually have covered them. They were trailed by the craft, which seemed to move in complete silence as it got lower by degrees until it was hovering directly above them. The couple stopped the car and observed around 10 figures in the aircraft's windows seemingly watching them. The alien creatures managed to communicate with them that they were to remain where they were. The Hills would then return to their home and begin to immediately notice some oddities. There was damage to their clothes that they couldn't explain, and when they tried to remember details about the strange encounter, they found that it was difficult. While they could both write down a detailed description of seeing a flying object and it coming down towards them, anything beyond that seemed to just escape their memory. Their watches that they had both been wearing also stopped working and apparently refused to ever work again. After they made their official report, which the interviewer believed to be truthful, nothing much else really kind of happened until more than a week later when Betty began to have dreams. She was able to recall these persistent dreams with accuracy that she had never known before, and they painted a much more intricate story of their strange encounter. Memories of being marched through wooded areas by gray aliens with her husband not far behind, details of clothing that they wore, and the manner in which they behaved. And a strange recollection of the couple being returned to their car and observing the craft leaving when neither of the pair had remembered leaving the car in the first place. But if you would like to hear more about this, like I said, I do have a video over it and it goes into way more detail. But getting back to the topic at hand, the autopsy of the body at the reservoir was only revealed to the public in 1994. Whether this was deliberately issued by some governing body or whether it was leaked has never really been established. The contents of it, however, did little to quell the growing mystery and wild theories that have been building around this mutilated body since its discovery. Most of what has been discussed already was in there. The removal of the internal organs, the complete lack of blood, the extensive mutilation to the head and face. It was noted that the corpse lacked the typical smell of rotting that would be expected. Given the background of the Night of UFOs and the well-known stories of alien abductions, everything about this odd finding led some of the public to believe this was yet more work of the aliens. Some hapless soul that had been beamed up against their will and suffered indescribable torture under the knife of brutal extraterrestrial surgeons. An alien scientist with a desire on understanding the human body and not caring much for the life of their subjects. Of course, there were still more standard rumblings of yet another murder victim dumped in a remote and well-known dumping ground. But on the whole, these were far quieter than the suggestions of little green men revisiting an old stomping ground and discarding yet more prey. In many ways, as strange as it sounds, it's easy to see why the minds of the public jumped to something supernatural when the body was discovered. What little information was given out seemed to defy explanations and expectations of anybody, because it's obvious it really couldn't have been conventional, right? While the theories of little green men, untold experiments of bizarre construction, and ultimately horrible death circulated, there were more grounded theories as well. It's worth noting that there is every chance that this was just a brutal gang slaying and the corpse was brutalized as a message. After all, there was a reason people generally stayed clear of the reservoir. If there was a known dumping ground for murdered bodies, at the very least, you'd have to be wary of spending too much time there, far less allowing children in the area. Looking at the whole situation in the cold light of day, while there are elements of the condition of the corpse that would raise eyebrows, much of it feels like it's been blown up more than it was. For instance, if you remove the intestines of somebody, they actually decompose slower. Because what happens is when you bloat like that, the bacteria in your intestines does actually help to decompose you because it will just go rampant and start attacking everything to break it down for energy. So, I don't know. To me, it just kind of seems like it's absolutely possible that, yeah, if the intestines are removed, they wouldn't smell as bad as if they had been left in there because there's not that bacterial hit. Now, this isn't to confuse that you don't decompose at all, because you absolutely will just by bacteria in the environment, but it is something of note as to why they wouldn't decompose in the exact same way. And as gruesome as it may be, the eyes, the tongue, and an ear being removed is not nearly as suspicious as they first appear. There are areas of the face that are surprisingly fragile and vulnerable to either natural decay or, more likely, scavengers. Dead and dying cattle of sheep have been well known to have their eyes literally pecked out by crows, and any human remains, if left exposed for a significant length of time, would be subject possibly to the same fate. The tongue is a relatively soft tissue, and while it makes most of us kind of squeamish to imagine, any scavenging bird or land animal would be more than equipped to eat those away and take any external extremity given long enough time passing. Well then, what about this single ear removed? Again, there is a possibility that due to the position of the body and how it was found, that one of the ears was exposed and accessible, and the other, being saved from nature's dining table, had been trapped underneath the head. While the autopsy never really specifically ruled it out, these specific removals would sadly not be uncommon amongst violent gangs either. Severing the ears of enemies while dead or alive is not only a tool for instilling fear used by the more modern criminals, but actually dates back hundreds and thousands of years in human history, because it's kind of funny we tell stories about monsters, but the real monsters are usually just humans. So is the removal or destruction of the eyes and eyesight, as well as cutting out tongues, whether symbolic or an act of pure cruelty? And it would only be fair to balance it all out by considering the UFO theory. After all, there is nothing in the remains or the accounts at the time to specifically rule out alien intervention. Is it possible, even if unlikely, that this unfortunate soul was taken up into a hovering spacecraft? Were the injuries inflicted upon them the result of some twisted experimentation by beings beyond our comprehension that wanted to better understand how we operated as a species? After all, we have acted in very similar ways ourselves as a species, so why wouldn't something else? We have cut open, taken to pieces, prodded, and poked every inch of every living thing we can get our hands on in the search of knowledge. But I mean, we're human, so while we like to dress it up under the guise of research and justifiable experimentation in an endless search to further human understanding, why is it that we balk at the prospect of being the ones under the microscope instead of the ones wielding it? Given the age-old case, the delay in the autopsy findings being released, and the dilution of solid facts in the passage of time since that day nearly 35 years ago, maybe the answer is that we will never know. We can never be sure if the body at the reservoir was a corpse mutilated by his fellow man, or if he's a victim of a murder that nature reclaimed bit by bit. If he lost his life due to an accident or natural cause and had his remains partially eaten by local wildlife. Or indeed, the last thing he saw on the face of this earth was in fact not of this earth at all. As with many, if not all things, what you choose to believe is entirely up to you. Just maybe keep half an eye on the starlight sky above you, and if you're wandering around the Brazilian reservoir in the middle of the night, my advice is don't. But I want to hear what you guys think. Do you really think that it was an alien abduction, or do you think it was probably just humans? I mean, like I said, humans tend to be the real monsters in these things, and a lot of this stuff really just isn't that strange. I mean, vulnerable organs getting picked out of your face, especially your ears being taken out, that's very normal. No blood being at the scene just means you could have been easily bled somewhere else, and intestines being removed. Sounds like they wanted the body to keep more than anything so that it could be found. Sounds more like a message to me, but let me know down in the comments what you think. I'd like to thank my patrons real quick also. At the Literal Wendigo tier, we have Grayson West, thank you. And then at the Eyewitness to the Account tier, we have Mushroom Dance. And at first-hand accounts, we have Beaver Malaga, probably pronounced that right. At the second-hand accounts, we have Kanan Johnston, Justice Davis, and Troy. And to everybody else, I really do appreciate your support on kind of like this fledgling Patreon thing and kind of getting Roanoke Tales back up and running kind of more properly. I hope you guys are enjoying all this stuff. If you are, let me know down in the comments. If you have any suggestions for the future, drop those in the comments as well, as I always read them and I usually cover them. So anyways, guys, I appreciate y'all watching. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.